Star Wars is one of the most beloved science fiction franchises in all history. It's been able to reach out to so many people with the original trilogy by which the entire Star Wars franchise is centered around, and has been able to explore very interesting concepts, especially in all the spin-off media. Most of the spin-off media is set years before the original trilogy takes place in the Star Wars lore. The entire conflict of the Star Wars franchise centers around this big conflict with all kinds of space creatures and robots, but generally revolves around this big conflict between good and evil, between the Jedi and the Sith, who use this divine supernatural energy called the Force. The Jedi used the light side of the Force for good, the Sith used the dark side of the Force for their own evil ends. And for many years, the Jedi have been able to triumph over the Sith. However, in the events of the prequel era, the Jedi got too cocky and overlooked that the Sith would eventually take over and form an empire. Because of this, there have been various characters who have been very angry with the hypocrisy of the Jedi. The Jedi Council, led by the little green wise creature named Yoda, were confident that the Sith were no more and that they'd train future generations of Jedi. However, over the years, it seems that Yoda and the Jedi overlooked the darkness that was growing from within their very premises. And in the Star Wars lore, there have been various characters who have gotten very angry towards this hypocrisy of the Jedi. Among them is this peculiarly bitter woman named Kreia.
I am but a mirror, whose only purpose is to show you what your own eyes cannot yet see.
For those who don't know who Kreia is, she is a rather prominent character in the video game called Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2. Her backstory, in summary, is that she was once a Jedi until she was betrayed, so she joined the Sith, only to then get betrayed. Kreia then started having some deeper thoughts about the Force and its implications, and began to grow bitter towards it. Kreia began to realize that as much as the Force could be used for good by the Jedi, it could also draw people into the dark side to become Sith. And she began to see the Force as something ominous, as if the Force was intentionally causing this never-ending conflict between the light and the dark, with seemingly no concluding resolution. So in Kreia's mind, she tried to use some thought-provoking philosophy to try to put an end to this never-ending conflict between light and dark and the Force for good. How would she go about doing this? Her long-term plan was to cut herself off from the Force's influence, essentially becoming a Star Wars equivalent of Nietzsche's Übermensch. In the short term, she would go around and lecture people on some thought-provoking lessons, particularly to the player-controlled character in the game. Even though Kreia was questionable among Star Wars fans, who could possibly forget some quotes such as, "Be careful with charity, unless you do more damage than you would do with a clenched fist."
Why did you do such a thing? Such kindnesses will mean nothing. His path is set. Giving him what he has not earned is like pouring sand into his hand. What if by surviving another day he brings a greater darkness upon another? The Force binds all things. The slightest push, the smallest touch, sends echoes throughout life. Even an act of kindness may have more severe repercussions than you know or can see. By giving him something he has not earned, perhaps all you have helped him become is a target. Seeing another elevated often brings the eyes of others who suffer. And perhaps in the end, all you have wrought is more pain. And that is my lesson to you. Be careful of charity and kindness, lest you do more harm with open hands than with a clenched fist.
Or in how believing an ideology is to be willing to break it.
To believe in an ideal is to be willing to betray it. It is something no Sith or Jedi has ever truly learned.
Or that apathy is death.
So you will do nothing? Apathy is death. Worse than death. Because at least a rotting corpse feeds the beasts and insects.
You'd think with a mentality like that, she would become more of a grey Jedi similar to Qui-Gon Jinn. Yet she's still holding bitterness towards the Jedi for their hypocrisies. And it's revealed by the end of the game that she's reverted back to more of her Sith lineages.
I will be honest with you. I have fallen to the dark side. Am I not worthy of redemption?
It's then revealed by the end of the game that Kreia returned to her leanings towards the Sith. Not a full-on Sith, but it's interesting how the story makers chose to have her look more like her Sith self than her Jedi self for this particular moment where the player can choose to either go through with her ideology or reject it. Now, at face value, Kreia does have some intriguing things to say, and in many respects they are worth listening to. After all, everyone wants to resolve war, and people have the right to think for themselves. Perhaps Kreia can try to indoctrinate lots of people to cut themselves off from the Force, but notice how Kreia has her aesthetics leaning more towards that of a Sith. It's as if to indicate that despite her intentions, she hasn't let go of that bitterness.
Many people seem to believe that Kreia sees the Force as evil. I invite you to go through my vast playlist of Kreia videos and find one moment that indicates that belief. You won't. The truth is that she hates the Force. That's different.
It is said that the Force has a will. It has a destiny for us all. I wield it, but it uses us all, and that is abhorrent to me, because I hate the Force. I hate that it seems to have a will, that it would control us to achieve some measure of balance when countless lives are lost. But in you, I see the potential to see the Force die, to turn away from its will, and that is what pleases me. You are beautiful to me, Exile.
So even if she did successfully cut herself off from the Force, that bitterness will still remain, and thus there's still darkness lurking within her. I don't know if that was the writer's intention for the game, but given how Kreia is portrayed as somewhat of a villain, I think the player subconsciously knows this. Of course, the choice on whether or not to join her, given the natures of RPGs, are entirely up to the player. But today, as of recording this, on the Monday after Palm Sunday, I was watching this insightful video by this very insightful Simpsons character named Max Derrett, who made this collaborative video talking about Kreia, and how Kreia's character is similar to Nietzsche and his philosophy of the Übermensch. As a man who's looked into philosophy in his spare time, even being familiar with some of Nietzsche's teachings, I've noticed that there's some innate tragedy about Kreia's philosophy. No, it's not the betrayal she's experienced. It's mainly in the fact that her philosophy, as insightful as it is incomplete. There is quite a popular YouTube video series analysing the character of Kreia and what she has to say, and I remember this one part in the series that says that Kreia's own philosophy doesn't really have a real conclusion. Apart from her will to cut herself off from the Force, that's not going to stop the fact that, according to Star Wars lore, the Force will continue to exist. And if there is any kind of evil, there will be good to overcome it, because evil is merely the lack of good. Or as J.R.R. Tolkien said, evil cannot create, it can only destroy. So only goodness can create some genuine good change. I don't know whether the writers of Kreia intended this or not, but this comparison between her and Nietzsche makes thematic sense given the contents of the story. And like Kreia, Nietzsche's own philosophy is incomplete. So a question arises among people who are into the Star Wars lore. If Kreia pointed out something in the Force that was worth thinking about, and if there doesn't seem to be an end between the conflict of light and dark, then what is the solution? Sure, in the context of the Star Wars lore, cutting oneself off from the influence of the Force may solve the conflict. But if everyone chose what is good and what is evil in their own eyes, then what's to stop the people within that group from unintentionally committing war on each other, all because they had differing conflicting views of good and evil? Thus, the conflict between good and evil wouldn't actually end. And not to mention, the Force will still continue to exist. So what's the solution? A thought occurred to me as I recalled the final arc of Season 6 in Star Wars The Clone Wars, when Yoda has his own journey with the Force. During that arc, Yoda has to confront a terrifying truth that he's seemingly been suppressing for so many years. That Yoda too has a dark side. Let me give you the context of this particular story arc. During the prequel era of Star Wars, Yoda begins to hear the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn from beyond the grave, and is invited to travel to a planet that is strong with the energy of the Force. During his journey, he learns that Qui-Gon Jinn was able to become what is called a Force ghost. Previously, it was believed by Yoda and others that when someone dies, they just simply become one with the energy of the Force. In the final arc of Season 6, though, Yoda learns that it is possible for heroic Jedi to allow their consciousness to exist after death, and come back in the form of Force ghosts. To embrace this state of being in the Force, Yoda has to confront several challenges, in which he must self-reflect. The most notable challenge is when Yoda seemingly fights a dark gremlin-like version of himself. This evil version of Yoda that he wrestles with seems to represent the dark side that Yoda has been suppressing. Yoda deliberately chose not to empower the dark side so as not to give in to evil, a noble ambition. However, it would seem that Yoda and several of the other Jedi became quite smug and prideful of being associated with the light side. And in this supposed arrogance, they've unintentionally let their dark side slip out in the form of hypocrisy. Yoda tries to deny that this dark part of him could ever be actually a part of him. But because Yoda refuses to accept this, he begins to lose the fight and take a big beating. But then Yoda begins to take the upper hand in the spiritual warfare when he realizes this convicting truth, that Yoda does recognize this dark part of him. Yoda confesses that he does have a dark side.
Recognize you, I do.
And from being humble enough to finally admit this, only then is Yoda able to properly reject his dark side. He says to his dark side, "A part of me you are. Reject you I do." Through this test and other tests, Yoda is able to have peace at last. So Yoda was able to defeat his own innate evil by confessing that morally he's no different than anybody else, and he's even failed his own moral standards. And from that realization, he finds the motivation to better his character. And from that discipline, he's able to properly reject the dark influence within him. So Yoda was able to completely demolish the evil within him, whereas Kreia still continues to struggle with it. Both Kreia and Yoda came to a realization about the hypocrisy of the Jedi. In the short term, Kreia had some insightful things to say, whereas Yoda and other Jedi like him deny that there were any problems with the Jedi Council.
Part of me you are. Yes. Through patience and training, it is I who control you. Reject you I do.
However, in the long term, Kreia's own philosophy didn't have a satisfying conclusion, and she ended up feeling more bitter. And she ended up holding on to that bitterness. Thus, there's a darkness that still remains within her by the very nature of trying to be in that balance of good and evil.
It is such a quiet thing to fall, but far more terrible is to admit it.
Whereas Yoda confessed that he's done evil himself, that there is evil within him, and finds the profound change to grow and better himself, and then defeat the evil from within him, and then in the long term, he can help others defeat the evil from within themselves as well.
You have conquered your hubris.
Yoda succeeds where Kreia fails. On a more personal note, I can guarantee that what Yoda experienced can genuinely work on you as well. Because evil doesn't come from other external parties you may be hostile to. Evil comes from the human heart, so we humans are no different from one another. In order to truly get rid of evil, we must embrace humility. When you embrace humility, you become humble. When you become humble, you embrace that path to redemption. When you embrace that path to redemption, you improve your character. And when your character is improved, you become a wholesome person. And you've managed to get rid of the evil within you thanks to that path of redemption. It may be possible to get rid of evil by cutting oneself off from conflicts, but other types of evil would still remain. Grudges, bitterness, self-exaltation as mere human beings. But what truly defeats evil is humility. In fact, I can think of a wise character from another franchise that can say why humility just works. And I'll end the video there. May the Force be with you.
Saruman believes that it is only a great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. I found it is the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love.
I see it, and now it's all within my reach. Possibility. I see it now. It's always been inside of me.
Star Wars is one of the most impactful science fiction franchises in recent history. It's been able to astonish so many people with the original trilogy by which the entire French